In the Soviet Union of the 1930s, the price of treason was simple: a trial, a sentence, a bullet. But for a poet, the price of truth was far more complex and far more terrifying. His name was Osip Mandelstam. He was not a general, nor a politician, nor a conspirator. His only weapon was the word. And with that weapon, he committed the ultimate act of defiance. He wrote a poem, just 16 lines. 16 lines that mocked, satirized, and condemned. The man who ruled an empire through silence and fear. A single poem, whispered among friends, became a death sentence. This is the story of how a poet's courage challenged a dictator's paranoia, of how art collided with absolute power, and how Joseph Stalin, the man who executed millions, was forced to ask himself one impossible question. Does the executioner fear the artist more than the soldier? The historian and biographer Rosemary Sullivan, who chronicled the lives of those who lived and died under Stalin's shadow, captures the essence of this impossible defiance. Mandelstam's rebellion was unlike any other. He believed that poetry existed beyond politics, that the human spirit could not be owned. Stalin's regime answered with its own creed. There is no private life, no independent thought. The state owns the human soul, and the price of independence is erasure. Before he became a political victim, Osip Mandelstam was a giant of Russian letters, a poet whose voice carried the clarity of truth in an age that worshipped chaos. He belonged to the Acmeists, a movement that rejected the wild abstractions of revolutionary art. While others rushed to glorify the Bolshevik utopia, Mandelstam and his circle sought something older, something purer: form, precision, and beauty. Where the revolution demanded slogans, he demanded clarity. Where others bent their words to the party, he bent his to truth. For Mandelstam, poetry was not a political instrument. It was a sacred act. Each word was a covenant with the eternal, not an offering to a commissar. This was his first rebellion, quiet, invisible, but absolute. In a world where every artist was commanded to sing for the state, Mandelstam chose silence. He would rather live in poverty than prosper as a liar. Years passed in hardship. He survived on scraps of translation work, haunted by hunger, but unbent in spirit. He guarded one conviction above all: that the realm of poetry was the last refuge. The state could never truly invade. His wife and unyielding chronicler, Nadezhda Mandelstam, would later write of this defiance, the kind that could not be seen, but would one day cost him everything. He was simply unable to write on command. For him, the word was a matter of life and death, not a device for political lies. This inability to lie was what finally cost him his life. By the early 1930s, Osip Mandelstam was living in a peculiar kind of exile. Not in Siberia, but inside his own country, banished without bars, condemned to breathe the thin air of invisibility. He was free, but only by the state's definition of the word. He could walk the streets of Moscow, but not publish, not work, not even legally rent a room. The Soviet Union had perfected the art of punishment without trial. It did not need to imprison the poet's body. If it could starve his soul instead, For a man whose life was built on words, this silence was a slow execution. The presses were closed to him. The journals no longer printed his name. The phone stopped ringing. He existed in the margins, a ghost among the living. Yet, he refused to yield. While others traded truth for comfort, Mandelstam clung to his moral solitude. He continued to write, each line a whispered act of rebellion against the suffocating machinery of fear. In their tiny, dim apartment, his wife, Nadezhda Mandelstam, became his scribe, his lookout, his archive. She memorized his verses by heart, in case the police ever came for the paper. Together, they turned the act of writing into an act of war. By late 1933, the silence had reached its breaking point. Across Moscow, the purges had not yet begun, but the fear was already alive. A nervous, trembling quiet before the storm. And in that stillness, Mandelstam made his fatal choice. He decided to aim his words at the one man who stood beyond criticism, the one name no tongue dared utter except in reverence. Joseph Stalin. The literary historian Clarence Brown, who spent decades tracing the rhythm of Mandelstam's final years, would later capture the poet's state of mind with chilling clarity. He was already a martyr waiting for his cross. The poverty and isolation had stripped away everything but his conscience. When he finally wrote the poem, he knew it was a sentence. But in that certainty, he found his terrible freedom. The year was 1933, a season of fear. Across the vastness of the Soviet Union, millions moved through their days in silence. A silence deeper than loyalty, thicker than snow. People had learned the art of not hearing, not seeing, not speaking. But in a cramped Moscow apartment, one man decided that silence was no longer possible. Osip Mandelstam picked up his pen and wrote the most dangerous poem in the world. It was only 16 lines long, 16 lines of fire, 16 lines that would become his death warrant. He called no names, yet every word pointed like a dagger toward one man, the Kremlin Highlander. The poem painted Stalin as monstrous and grotesque, his thick fingers like worms, his mustache crawling like a parasite. It mocked the sycophants who surrounded him, a thin-necked bunch of fruit eaters, and it named him, in spirit, if not in word, the dealer of death, a ruler who found joy in the suffering of others. It was not merely satire, it was poetic execution, a public dissection of a god made of fear. Mandelstam knew what he had done. He didn't need an audience to understand the cost. His wife, Nadezhda, knew too. Together, they burned the paper copy, memorizing every line like a shared secret of damnation. There would be no evidence, but there would also be no escape. He whispered the poem only to a few trusted friends, other writers, other believers in the sanctity of the word. Among them was Boris Pasternak, the future author of Dr. Zhivago. When Pasternak heard the verses, he felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Mandelstam and said, quietly, almost like a prayer, "That is not a poem. It is a suicide note." But the words had already left the cage, and in Stalin's Russia, words flew faster than whispers. and landed always in the same place, on the desk of the secret police. Before dawn on a cold May morning in 1934, the NKVD came knocking. They tore through the Mandelstam's apartment, their boots echoing off the bare floors, their flashlights cutting through the dark. They found no paper, no proof, but they took the poet anyway. In that moment, the man who had written of truth was swallowed by the machinery of terror. The only thing left behind was a memory and a question: what happens when the dictator reads the poem? Because this time he did, and what happened next was stranger, darker, and more revealing than anyone could have imagined. When the poem reached Joseph Stalin, the outcome should have been automatic. A death sentence, swift and unremarkable. But something unexpected happened. The dictator, whose word could extinguish millions, paused. And for reasons no one could fully explain, he chose to handle the case himself. At first, the machinery of terror moved as usual. The order went out. Arrest Mandelstam. The poet was taken, interrogated, broken down. Then, in a rare moment of intervention, one of Stalin's own comrades, Nikolai Bukharin, an old Bolshevik and literary admirer, dared to make a plea for the poet's life. No transcript survives, but fragments of the conversation between Bukharin and Stalin echo through memoirs and rumor. The dictator's tone was calm, almost playful, his decision chillingly deliberate. He spared the poet. Instead of execution, he ordered exile to the frozen isolation of Cherdyn, a desolate town buried deep in the Ural Mountains. For a man who killed entire populations with a signature, this act of restraint seemed absurd. But it wasn't mercy. It was control. Historians believe Stalin saw himself, not just as ruler of Russia, but as its final arbiter of art. To kill Mandelstam outright would make him a martyr. To let him live, to let him starve, suffer, and fade into obscurity was a more exquisite punishment. This was not clemency. It was theater, a lesson for every artist who dreamed of freedom. Stalin was declaring that even art itself existed only by his permission, that the poet's pulse, his breath, his very words belonged to the state and to him. As the scholar Clarence Brown later wrote, Stalin felt he had the right to dispense with poets. The exile to Cherdyn was his personal statement. You live because I choose for you to live. Your art is nothing unless I permit it. He wanted the poet to understand that the master of life and death was still him. In Stalin's world, even survival was a form of punishment. And for Osip Mandelstam, the exile would not be the end. It was merely the beginning of his final descent. The exile to Cherdyn in 1934 was not an act of mercy. It was a psychological operation, a slow, deliberate disintegration of a man's soul. Stalin had placed the poet in the farthest reaches of isolation, a remote town wrapped in silence and surrounded by invisible watchers. The NKVD didn't need to stand outside his door. Their presence lived in every shadow, every echo of a knock that never came. Officially, this was called preservation, but the true purpose was obliteration, not of the body, but of the mind. Mandelstam was stripped of everything. That had given his life meaning, the conversation of other poets, the rhythm of language, the electric pulse of Moscow's artistic world. He was alive but sealed inside a void built precisely for despair. The punishment was working. The poet, once defiant, began to unravel. He could no longer endure. The endless waiting for a bullet that never came. In an act of unbearable hopelessness, Osip Mandelstam attempted suicide. He survived, only because his wife, Nadezhda, caught him between life and death, pulling him back from the abyss. The state, in its cold bureaucracy, then offered what it called leniency. His exile was softened. He was transferred to Voronezh, a gray provincial city where he lived under constant surveillance. There, in the hollow quiet, Mandelstam tried to adapt. He wrote new poems, careful, cautious, desperate, to prove that he could still exist within the lines, drawn by the party. He wrote for air, for memory, for Nadezhda, for survival itself. But every word trembled with fear. Every line was a whisper between the living and the condemned. As the literary scholar Clarence Brown later observed, Stalin had given him the worst punishment, not the clean bullet, but the agony of waiting. He was forced to live, knowing that the smallest tremor in the political atmosphere would seal his doom. His mind was in a permanent state of siege. In Voronezh, the poet still breathed, but it was the breath of a man who already knew he had been buried alive. While Osip Mandelstam struggled to write in exile, his wife, Nadezhda, was quietly undertaking a mission of impossible courage, a mission Stalin could never have foreseen. She understood something the dictator did not, that memory could outlive the state. The Soviet machine was designed to erase people completely, their names, their works, their very existence from history. Every manuscript was a threat, every poem a piece of evidence. The NKVD seized and destroyed them all, but Nadezhda refused to let the silence win. She began the painstaking task of committing every one of her husband's poems to memory, line by line, verse by verse, night after night. She turned her mind into an archive. When paper was forbidden, memory became resistance. When the written word was lethal, she made the human mind the last safe house for truth. Through years of exile, through war, through the gray dread of Stalin's renewed purges, she carried those poems in her head, reciting them in secret, whispering them to herself each day, so that they would not fade. It was not merely love, it was defiance. She understood that Stalin could kill the man, but he would never kill the word. The writer and former Gulag prisoner, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, himself no stranger to the machinery of state terror, would later pay tribute to her act of preservation. She was the only guaranteed witness. Nadezhda created the only possible form of safe storage. In the Soviet Union, the human memory. Her act ensured that his voice, rather than the executioner's silence, would define his legacy. And so, in the darkest years of the Soviet century, the voice of a condemned poet survived in the mind of one woman, the living monument Stalin could never destroy. But by 1937, the air in the Soviet Union had turned poisonous. The fragile truce between the poet and the tyrant was over. The state no longer needed subtlety, it only needed obedience. The Great Purge had entered its final, frenzied stage. No one was safe, not generals, not ministers, not even those who had served faithfully for decades, and certainly not a poet whose very existence was an act of defiance. In 1938, Osip Mandelstam was arrested for the second and final time. There was no midnight phone call from Bukharin, no cryptic mercy from Stalin. The dictator no longer saw a man to toy with, only another entry in the endless column of names, to be processed, condemned, and forgotten. The poet who had once shaken the Kremlin with 16 lines was now just another prisoner, lost in the machinery he had once mocked. He vanished into the frozen sprawl of the Gulag, absorbed by its infinite hunger. No grave, no marker, no final word. Only the memory that Nadezhda Mandelstam carried. A living echo of a man whom the regime tried to erase, but never truly silenced. The final stop for Osip Mandelstam was a nameless patch of earth on the far edge of the world, the Vitoraya Rechka transit camp, outside the port city of Vladivostok. It was not a prison. It was a waiting room for death, a place where men arrived hungry, sick, and broken, and where many never left. The camps were chaos, a blur of bodies, disease, and cold. There were no guards of mercy, no record of compassion, only paperwork and winter. Frail, delirious, and starved, Mandelstam did not survive long. The official record, the Soviet truth, states simply heart failure. December 27th, 1938. But the truth was buried with him, somewhere beneath the frozen soil of the Soviet East, in a common grave with hundreds of others whose names would never be spoken again. For a time, it seemed Stalin had won. The poet was gone. The voice was silenced. The page was empty. But history, as always, rewrites itself in whispers. In Moscow, Leningrad, and across the frozen steppes, one woman kept the flame alive. Nadezhda Mandelstam, his wife, his witness, his archivist, turned memory into resistance. She carried 40,000 lines of her husband's poetry in her mind, word for word, breath for breath. Every line a rebellion, every syllable a refusal to forget. For 30 years, she lived in poverty and fear, reciting those words to herself every night, keeping the poet alive where no state could reach. When the Soviet frost finally began to thaw, the poems resurfaced, smuggled, printed, and read across the world. Osip Mandelstam had been murdered by Stalin's machine, but his words escaped the grave. The dictator erased his body. The poet reclaimed eternity. Because in the end, the word outlived the empire. And the man who mocked the Kremlin Highlander in 16 forbidden lines won the only victory that mattered, the victory of memory over fear and truth over power.